Hi, you're with Kelly Wilson of the Wilson team, and today we are going to bring you a very, very special guest, somebody that I've known for about 10 years and is a very, very experienced property manager in the Eastern Ontario region. Her name is Anne Burgoon, and she is with Eastern Ontario Property Management Group. Her head office is in Brockville. And she does have a great team. They've got a couple of divisions within that team. But the reason we wanted to bring Anne in today is because there is a lot to know about buying and owning property. And if you're going to take the plunge into becoming a landlord, there's a lot of things that you sort of need to know. And this is part of that whole team we are always discussing about. You can do things the right way, or you can do things the wrong way. And the wrong way can cost a lot of money, which is, I think, a lot of people's fears when they're looking at trying to get involved in building wealth with real estate. So we wanted to bring somebody who is an expert and has been a huge lifesaver in terms of helping me navigate over the last 10 years and really bringing so much value to the table for me and the people that I've been, be able to work with, and investors that I've worked with, because we work with a lot of them. And she's now currently helping probably close to 100 of investors as we speak, of people that we've been able to introduce and help mitigate risk and things like that. So Anne, maybe you want to talk a little bit about yourself, and thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks, Kelly. We actually are a small property management company in Brockville, Ontario. My husband and I have the company. We have a staff of approximately 17, and we cover the area as far west as Aurora, just outside of Toronto, Brockville along the St. Lawrence to Cornwall, into Ottawa, and all the small towns in between that nobody would service. And we actually got into the business because we ourselves were investors in condominiums. We were not property managers. I was working in the medical field, and my husband, was working in the engineering field. And we brought these investments, and they weren't doing very well. And so we fell into the property management business and moved out here from the Toronto area and started up our small company.
And so, 17 is quite a few people, And I think the biggest question you have is, or I guess people have, is, do I hire somebody, right? Do I try to navigate this on my own? So the biggest thing that I think we're trying to determine is sort of, I've made the first property investment, whether it's multi-unit, commercial or residential, whatever you decide. But when do you think is a good time somebody should take the plunge into hiring somebody else? Because a lot of people think it takes a lot of time out of your day, right, to manage properties. So maybe you can sort of help navigate what should people be thinking about before they make a call to you.
Okay. Well, I think what they have to look at is, most of the times people start off, quite often I think, they start off as landlords with one unit, and they think it's fairly manageable with the one unit, especially if they have a tenant who's paying on time. They have a great tenant, the property is in very good shape, and they get very few calls, and they have to pay very little attention to it. Most people can manage that. I think that we will often get calls when all of a sudden somebody's run into a problem with a tenant and they don't quite understand the legislation and their rights, or a tenant has all of a sudden gotten the landlord-tenant board involved and has reported the landlord for an issue. And quite often it's about an issue that the landlord knew nothing about. They had violated a tenant's right without even knowing they were violating a tenant's right. So I think typically, as long as things are going well for a landlord, they manage it on their own, and they have a good tenant, good relationship, they collect the rent, they go forward, and they're doing just fine. It's one of those things that they usually typically call us when they just kind of get into, unknown waters to them and they don't know how to navigate it. Having said that, though, we often will run into landlords who have been managing it on their own, but still nonetheless have made some significant errors or put themselves at risk. And one of the big ones is not doing regular inspections and documenting the inspections of the unit in writing, as well as documenting that you're checking the smoke detectors. That's a big one that the landlords just forget to do yearly. And you have to do it. The number of times that we have taken over and gone to tribunal because an owner says the tenant's leaving and they left the unit, in a mess. And the tenant says, no, it was like that when I moved in. And I say to the landlord, do you have a copy of the condition of the unit when they moved in? Do you have a copy of the move-in inspection? And they look at me and go, I don't have a move-in inspection report. And I said, well, the tribunal will say you must prove that the unit was not like that when the tenant moved in. And if you cannot prove that, the tenant is not responsible for the damage that you think they're responsible for. So that's a big error that a lot of owners make when they're self-managing, is documenting and keeping track of the move-in, move-out, and make sure you're always checking on the smoke detectors, because they will blame it on the landlord if there's not a functioning smoke detector at the end of the day.
And I've seen a couple of bad cases, where people have decided to rent out their place and there has been a fire. There's been some very serious cases that I've seen, and what does that look like? Right, when it's the landlord's liability.
Absolutely.
Right.
And the fire department will fine the landlord. They'll say you had a responsibility to ensure there were working smoke detectors here. Now, if you move them in and on your move-in inspection, you check off the box saying smoke detector was tested and working at the time of move-in, and when there's a fire, they find that the smoke detector's been disconnected, but you have a copy that you had checked it when they moved in and it's within the last 12 months, the landlord is then covered. They will then blame the tenant for that. Unless the tenant can show documentation that they contacted the owner and said their smoke detector wasn't working and the landlord didn't take action. So those are all the, it sounds small, but you don't need to worry about it until you need to worry about it.
Oh, for sure. And it's always protect, cover yourself.
Yeah, you're behind.
And I think the biggest thing, and I know my very first property, I was 21 years old. I actually fell into it. Not because that's what I bought it for, but I was supposed to be moving in with somebody. And the very last day I got the keys, and they decided they didn't really want to grow up. They wanted to stay at home. So I thought myself, okay, what do I do, right? I should probably rent this out because I don't want to take it on all on my own. And I made that mistake in error. And of course, we always learn from our mistakes, but almost like the first people that came, I threw an ad online. These people came, they loved it. They said they didn't have any pets. I didn't probably do any I know I didn't do any reference checks. They just looked really nice, and we signed a lease. And I think maybe you could sort of walk us through. I know that we try to give as much advice as we can for new investors that are trying to rent the place on their own, right? But I guess talking about where is a good place to advertise, what kind of screening process do you do when you're starting to get calls from that ad?
Yeah, so we typically actually advertise on Kijiji. That seems to be the most successful place to advertise, and we have no problem, renting units with our ads being posted there. But once the ad is posted and we get a call, we actually do a site visit screening with the tenant. We don't want to, drive all the way and go down, meet with the person and find out that they can't even afford it based on their income, and they just were not aware that, there's some criteria for renting a unit. So we have some pre-screening questions, and they phone and say, I'd like to see this unit. What we often say is we ask them what their source of income is currently, how much money they make monthly, because we have a criteria of, at least 2.5 times the rental amount is the amount of their income should be. We also ask them why they're moving to try and determine if there's an issue here, if they've been evicted, what's going on. So if typically they have, really good reason, like I'm relocating and, I'm starting a new job, or this is my income, and it meets our criteria, then we actually arrange a site visit. We won't even arrange one until we answer those questions first. Once they're on site, we will do things like we actually look at the type of car they drive up in, you know. You meet with them, you walk them around, you ask them questions about, you know, where they're currently living, and you try and get, you know, you make friends with them, and you try and just get to know them and see if they would be a good fit for you and you for them. And then if they're willing to apply for the unit, you have them fill out an application form, and you do an employment check. We get pay stubs, and we speak to the employer, and we do a rental check, and contact the previous landlord. We like to go back at least 3 years. So if at the last location they were there less than 3 years, we would get 2 landlord references and contact them. If they're selling a home or moving from a home, we ask for proof of ownership of the home and proof that the home is up for sale. So there's a fair amount of information we try to get from them as we move along. And then of course we do the credit check as well. Sometimes if we still are not quite sure about something, I have staff that will actually go on Facebook and just go and check them out on Facebook to see if there's any information. You can see one guy presented very well, but there was just something in the back of my mind just felt off, and went on Facebook, and he had the scariest Facebook page I have ever seen. So I just said, yeah, I can't do this. You know, it was guns and swearing and partying, you know, pictures of partying and beer drinking. And I went, we don't want that. So there are various things that you can be very clever in how you check things out to make sure you have a good fit and a tenant who will be respectful of your property.
And how do you feel about people who have a very, are going through a very negative experience at the time, that they say, you know, my credit is very poor because of, or maybe trying to mitigate how many people are actually going to be moving into the property versus, you know, hey, it's me and my spouse, and then you find out there's 4 other people that have moved in. Is that something that you see? Because
yeah,
to match the tenants to the actual house, as you know, not a family of 5 moving into a 2-bedroom, right?
Yeah, that's a really, really tough one. So you can have, what we've started to do with some of our units is we actually attach a schedule to the lease, and the schedule is a set of rules. And you can put all kinds of things in your rules that are addendums to the lease and thus enforceable, as long as they're not rules that contravene the Residential Tenancy Act. But you can put them in and they're enforceable. You know, I certainly think that limiting the number of residents in a unit when the owner is paying the utility costs, especially something like water, and, you know, you think you're renting to 2, you set the rent at 2, assuming, you know, you'll have 2 people showering every day and laundry will be for 2 people, and all of a sudden you find out there are 6. You know, your water costs have gone through the roof. That's a problem. So there should be some sort of agreement that no additional people can move in without permission or review and so on. The challenge though is once they get somebody in, if you don't have that written in there, there's a problem. Remember that eviction can occur on 2 bases. Well, the eviction can occur under the Residential Tenancy Act, but you also have contract law at play. So if you have a contract with someone in your lease agreement on, you know, who's permitted or who's not permitted and how many number of residents, you can say they violated the contract, and you could go to small claims court and have them removed from the unit on that basis. So remember that you have 2 issues. You have contract law and you have Residential Tenancy Act that's in play at that time. So you could play on either of them, have some good set of rules, good set of understanding with them. And then, you know, if it arrives, you know, that you've got those 2 as remedies.
And what type of things are you recommending? I know pets are a big one where, you know, they can say no pets, but if they feel like bringing one in after the fact. And the other big one is smoking, right? Smoking in the unit. So maybe you could share your thoughts around those 2.
Sure. So smoking is when you're advertising for a unit or renting, you cannot say no smokers, because then you are identifying a person and you're discriminating against a person. What you can say is no smoking in the unit. So then you're categorizing an action. So that is permitted. So that wording is very important. You can't say no smokers, but you can say no smoking in the unit, and that is totally enforceable. So that's not an issue. The pet issue is much more difficult. Under the Residential Tenancy Act, a lease is considered null and void if it bans pets. So I think you have to be very careful on that front. The only time that you can ban pets is if it's in a condominium and the governing documents have a ban or limitation on pets. With the new Ontario leases that came into effect last year, there's actually a section in it, a clause in it that says, I understand that I'm living in a condominium and I understand that there, are governing documents and I will abide by them. And if there certainly is a pet clause, then they are obligated in that section of the lease, the new and provincial lease, to abide by it. And if it's a no pet, then it's a no pet and they must abide by it.
Okay. Now we are moving over into the lease, which is, it's a contract, right? I mean,
It's a contract.
Right. So maybe we can talk a little bit about in an environment where you hear a lot of landlords say that it's all about the tenants, right? It seems to be always favoring the tenant side. Maybe you can talk about some important clauses that need to be inside of the lease that work for both parties, right? Or common things that you're seeing or on your schedule when you're doing anything that you're omitting. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that lease.
Yeah, so it's a new provincial lease, which is, I think it's a really good thing. And, the fact that it now includes the clause about condominiums and, that tenants have to abide by it, it's great because previously that was not included. And there were a lot of gray areas and tenants thought they were exempt from having to comply with the governing document. So that's a positive. I think the important items to make sure that are covered are the amount of the rent, the due date that rent has to be paid. You have to say, what day of the month that you want it. If it's the first day, it's got to be the first day. Utilities. You have to clearly identify utility costs. And in there, make sure you're also including if you got a rental hot water tank. Are you asking them to pay for that? Is that included in the rent amount, or it's an additional cost and you want that included in there for them? Things like landscaping. Do you want them to cut the grass in the summer, or are you paying for the grass to be cut? Snow removal. Those are things that you have to make sure you outline very clearly in your lease so they understand who is responsible for it. And I think they sometimes get overlooked until you run into trouble and then the tenant says, I didn't see anywhere in there that it said I had to cut my own grass. I don't even have a lawnmower. So those are some of the things that I think I would focus on for sure. And, the length of the lease, whether you're going with a month to month or you're locking in for a 1-year lease. If you're an investor and you think you might be wanting to sell your unit in the near future, you will want to go likely with a month to month, unless you feel very strongly that you're likely to sell your unit only to another investor. There are often investments that you feel fairly confident that the person buying it would probably be another investor. In that case, locking in and having an assured lease would be a good thing. I have a 1-year lease, a tenant signed it, and that's a good thing for somebody buying, and they feel that they won't have to be looking for a tenant anytime soon. But if you have a building or a unit that you think an owner may want to buy and move in, you want a month to month because you want to make sure you can give that tenant notice with 60 days notice and they have to move out. If you have a 1-year locked in lease, you can't get that tenant out until the end of that year.
And even if it's month to month, if you decide that you do want to sell it, it has to be somebody who's going to own or occupy.
Correct.
The unit, right?
Yeah.
So
otherwise
inflate rents.
That's right. If it's an investor, then they get to stay. That's right.
Exactly. So one of the things we want to talk about is the increase in rents, right? So that does fluctuate. How do you guys do the implementation? Do you talk to the landlord about whether they want to do the increase, if it's been a good tenant, or you just automatically suggest you just go with it, go with the set of inflation and move forward?
Yeah. So we typically with most of our investors, I can't think of any that, doesn't want the annual increase. Those are things that we normally discuss, when we first sign the contract. We do the automatic, we do it, at the 90-day notice. The only time that occasionally we might go back to the owner is if for some reason we've noticed that there's been a bit of a slump in the rents, and for whatever reason they're renting for a little bit less than we are presently getting, that we may go back to the investor and say, you know what, it's due for an increase, but I think if we go up, we're setting ourselves outside the market because the units are not renting for that anymore, and we may just want to hold tight where we are and just not put an increase in there. So we might go back to them and have that discussion with them if we feel that, an increase I just can't justify it. But typically it's at the 90-day mark, 90 day before the N1, when the N1 has to be issued, that we check out what the where it's at, and we will do the increase.
Okay. And one of the other things I think that scares people is they're not, honestly, the most common thing that I hear when I'm asking people about whether they want to own real estate as an investment is they say, you know what, I'm not handy. And I'm saying, I'm not handy. I don't need to be handy. That's, and that again, building your team. So what do you do if you're not somebody that has your phone on at 11 o'clock at night? If you're somebody who doesn't really have any connections, I guess you could say, or not knowing who to call to contact. So as part of your team, can you maybe share a little bit about how you would handle repairs, specific maintenance items? Do you have go-to people? Do you get any sort of discounts with anybody for appliances? I mean, maybe you can talk a little bit around that whole repair and maintenance. How do you price a job that needs to be done?
Yeah, so we have certainly we have our go-to plumber, we have our go-to electricians, and our handyman, and vendors that we purchase appliances from. And it's based on they provide good service. I don't have to call them back often. They do the job right, and they do it once. They're not the most expensive, and they may not be the least expensive. They're usually kind of middle of the road, because I think if you're going to get some good help, you got to pay them for it. And we send them out, and we know when the work is done. They know our process too, and they also, more importantly, because a lot of our investors are in the condominium industry, they understand how condominiums work, and they're very careful what they say when they enter the unit, because then tenants can sometimes ask questions that are really questions that are or answers are meant for the owner and not the tenant. And a lot of our vendors understand that, they just go in, they do their work, they're kind, they're amicable, but they're very careful on information they may be releasing to the tenant. So I think we have a really good team right now that provide the services to us. And more importantly, they know that when I call and there's an issue, they're very timely in responding and getting in there and getting the work done, and I don't kind of have to wait around. So that becomes important as well.
Well, I do know that in working with you over the last 10 years, I feel that you don't sleep ever. It doesn't matter
a little bit
what time of day or what evening. You're almost like me. We don't sleep, Anne.
Oh, I know.
Because you might get some crazy messages from me at 11 or 12 at night, right?
That's right.
So what do you do in case of an emergency? What happens?
Well, we have a 24-hour answering service, and
Okay.
the answering service has a call list. So, if it's in a building where there's a superintendent, they have the list of who they call first. So, it's superintendent first. Some of the owners of some of our buildings, because we manage some apartment buildings, the owner wants to be the next one on the list, and then we may be third one on the list. And then if they can't reach those two, they're then calling us. Or we're the first one on the list and they call us first, and then it's the other people after. So it varies. But yeah, we have our answering service has a very long checklist of people they just keep calling and rotating through. And if it's an emergency and they can't get a hold of anybody for whatever reason, and it's let's call it a plumbing issue, they have the name of the plumber that they eventually just dispatch if they can't get a hold of anybody for some reason.
Okay. I was going to ask you, what's one of the scariest emergencies that you think? I mean, you've been in this industry a long time.
It's an easy one. I mean, we've had many. We've had serious floods on Christmas Day, literally going down elevator shafts and flooding out units. We've had suicides. We've had murder-suicide.
Oh, right.
But I think the one that, probably took up the most of our time and was the scariest as I was racing to the building was when one of our buildings caught fire in Smiths Falls. It was a 21 unit apartment building, and it caught fire, and I got a call that it was on fire. And, I started driving there as people were sending me pictures along the way of the building in flames. And, you're worried about, did everybody get out? Was anybody injured? You then worry about the, firefighters going in and making sure. You're just worried about, life safety at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you're there, so we're contacting, literally in the car driving, I'm contacting the insurance company, I'm contacting the Red Cross, and I know I'm gonna have to start making arrangements for places for these people to live for that night. They would have nowhere to sleep.
That's
So, it was amazing. By the time I got there, and it was a 40-minute drive, I got there, the Red Cross was there. The insurance company had already dispatched a restoration company, and they were there. And of course, the police were there and the fire department were there, and they were amazing. The community came together. They sent out supports from the community. People were bringing in food. People were taking people into their homes. It was a bad event, but it rolled out very, very nicely. We set up a Facebook page to be able to communicate with some of these people because we had no way of communicating. They had lost their phones.
Mm-hmm.
People didn't have their car keys. They didn't have their wallets to, get money out of the bank. So it was trying to deal with all these issues. Then you had the media. Being careful what's said to the media and who they were speaking to, so controlling media and what was released to them. And, they got some things wrong and then making sure it was corrected. So that was an interesting one. It went very well. The building was rebuilt. It's a brand new building, and nobody was injured. Everybody got out safe. And for a bad situation, it actually rolled out very nicely.
And that's actually, we raise another point, which is, because you've probably seen so many things, is it important when you're sitting down with a new client, a new landlord, to make sure they have like very supportive insurance plans, right? In terms of how they're insuring the unit, the building, whether it's condominium or freehold. Do you have that discussion with them? Are there things that you're able to pinpoint out of the insurance coverage, or at least let them know they have to have as a minimum?
Yeah, I mean, the insurance thing is totally up to the investor, and I've had many conversations with many investors. I've had investors that they say they self-insure because they'll do that when it's in a condominium. And, as you know, in condominiums, there's a standard unit bylaw, typically your standard unit description, and the condominium corporation insures the owner up to that standard unit. And some of these standard units are very generous, and it covers pretty much everything except the appliances. And unfortunately, I've had some investors that they've chosen then not to insure because they figure all they would then have to insure if there's, in the event of a loss of the unit, is replace their appliances.
Mm-hmm.
But what they miss out on, though, there is, liability. What if the tenant got injured in the unit and decided to sue them? They have no liability coverage. So I think it can be a little bit short-sighted to self-insure, even if you're in a condominium and even if you have a very generous standard unit description and bylaw that's insured under the condominium corporation. You have to remember that you have the liability coverage that you require. And if you're an investor, you're not worried about contents, but certainly the tenant would want contents insurance. And you have betterments. If you somehow upgraded anything in your unit, the standard unit, of course, would not cover that insurance. So I've had those discussions with various owners, and at the end of the day, that it's their decision on what they insure with. But if you're in a condominium and you're getting insurance, when you're speaking to your broker, make sure you give them a copy of your standard unit description, your declaration, and your insurance deductible bylaw, and that will ensure they get you proper insurance. Most times, in condominiums, the owners are overinsured because they're doubling up on insurance that the corporation already has.
Oh yeah, very interesting. And you say betterment, so just in case people don't know what that is, because we have seen it, because if there is a problem and the condominium has to build it as to the guidelines of which it was originally built, currently, you know, new materials. One of the things that people don't do is if it's been upgraded, right? So that's your betterments, is if somebody else owned it and really made massive changes or renovations to it, right? Instead of laminate or, you know, or parquet, they might have put in hardwood and granite versus, you know, the standard sinks and lighting. So making sure you have the betterments insurance is huge, because you want it to go back up to the grade that you paid for it, right? Based on what the unit looked like.
Right.
Now, when you're meeting with potential new landlords or clients, is there things that they should have prepared for you? And is there a bit of an expectation that you want them, right, to uphold as well, right? I mean, you probably have an interview process. You just don't take anybody. So what does that look like?
Well, you meet with them to first of all, just to meet with them and see if you kind of, you know, see things the same way. So, you know, they're interviewing you, but you're interviewing them. You're trying to decide if it's a good fit. You try to determine what their expectations are. Because I think often, you know, there are challenges in those type of relationships, because I think there's a misunderstanding with expectations. So you want to get information on their current tenants. You want to look at the property. I think that tells probably us the most is, how is this property being maintained? Has this investor property maintained this unit? When I show up, is it, you know, decrepit, falling apart, paint peeling, wood rot? You know, that's a red flag to me that, you know, this is maybe somebody who's trying to do the bare minimum. And that may not be a good match for us. It may be a good match for somebody else. It's just not for us. Because, you know, liability is big. My first thing is I got to make sure that it's, you know, it's to code and it's safe and everybody's liability is reduced. So those are the things that we would look at initially when we would meet with them to take it over.
And how do you handle non-payments, right? I mean, there are circumstances. You can do a lot of screening in the beginning, and they might be great tenants, but something happened and their circumstances changed.
Sure,
right?
sure.
So how does that sort of work if you end up having to, if, you know, it goes past the first, now you're at the third? Tell me a little bit about that process and how sort of that works and plays out.
Yeah. So when we know that someone's missed rent payment, we typically will follow up initially just with a phone call and just say, hey, you know, looks like you forgot your rent, or, you know, where are things at? We typically do it with a phone call, and if they have email, do it as email, because you want to be able to have a paper trail. You want to do it both, but you want to do it friendly at first, because it could just be an oversight, or it could be that something happened and, you know, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just going to be a couple of days late, and so on. So you start off to get a feel of what's going on. And when you issue, you know, the N4, if they've been late with payment, I think it depends on the relationship you have with the tenant and their history. If it's someone that's been there 10 years, and in those 10 years they've maybe been late twice, you're going to just be a little bit more patient, right? They're a good tenant. They've caused you no grief. They take good care of it. You're just going to be a tiny bit more patient before you send off, you know, your form. But if it's somebody that this is like the fourth time in less than 12 months that they've been late, you're just issuing it. You just issue it, and it's, you know, call it a day. This is not working. You can't afford it. Your circumstances are such that it sounds like this is not a good fit for you anymore. So I don't think it's hard and fast. You want to work with the tenants and you want to build a good relationship with them, but you also want to protect the landlord, so you don't wait too long. But you do have a conversation with them to figure out what's going on and develop a plan with very, very set deadlines. You know, if it's someone there, their car broke down, or, you know, something happened, they said, you know, I'll get it to you by this date. You have a very set deadline for that date. And if it's not in, you're issuing your form.
And so when you issue the form, let's say it's somebody that, you know, it was an appeal to bring somebody in from a hard time, but you realize this is not a situation that's going away anytime soon. So at what point do you go from, hey, we need the rent by this time, and then it still doesn't come?
Well, you issue the N4. Yeah. I mean, I think that's where I would probably not go beyond a couple of weeks, you know, unless they have a very set plan. But typically, yeah, I would not probably go along that. I think if we had somebody for a very long time, though, you know, they've been great and you genuinely knew that there was a problem that was going on, you would talk to the landlord and say, how do you want to play this? You know, and quite often the landlords are a little bit softer than we tend to be, and they may say, oh, you know, give them a chance, wait a little bit, and we'll do that. But if it's left to us, we have to protect the investment. We're usually a couple of weeks is probably how far we'll stretch it before we issue the form.
And honestly, not to scare people, but the reality is you can make a mistake in bringing somebody in, right? So
Yeah.
I think about a client of mine who converted their home to a rental, bought another one, and didn't really do much of a screening, just kind of believe what they said and allowed them to come into the home. And this was just before winter hit. And they got the first and last up front, and then they never got another payment again. So they had, you know, they were at a loss, right? So it's understanding what the steps that need to be taken in order to make sure that they're not there for the next 6 months. So that, I guess that's what I'm sort of looking, what does that process look like to get somebody in the tribunal? They still don't leave, like, you know, what are those steps? And I guess what's one of the worst situations you've dealt with?
Oh, well, I mean,
Does that happen in your space?
You issue the N4 and then you wait. The greatest challenge is getting a date at the tribunal. It's getting a date. They can be 3 and 4 months out where you're sitting there and they're not paying rent and there's nothing you can do.
Exactly.
And they're just not paying. So those are the worst situations. But I think our very worst one was a gentleman who really, really knew the system. And he would go and make plans and promise, and the tribunal would, approve them. Or I know one time we finally got to the point where he was due for eviction by the sheriff. The sheriff shows up, and he shows them a form that he got a stay from the tribunal, that he had an extra couple of weeks because of, you know, he was able to show that he had made some payments. And, you know, the sheriff contacts us. I said, he never made any payments. He had forged documents. So we had to contact the tribunal and let them know that it was fake. It was not true. But he really knew it. He knew how to play it. He had forged documents and everything. So you have to be very careful. That was probably the worst one. But we ended up going to small claims with this guy. And his wife worked, and we were able to garnish her wages, and we got all the money back. So he played the system, but we got the money at the end of the day.
Yeah, and so a lot of people would have given up, right?
Yeah.
Right. So I think there's a lot of value in hiring the right professionals, right? And I think a lot of people are probably listening to this going, wow, that's a lot of information and that's a lot of sort of workaround. The reality is, you know, we probably don't spend more than 10, 15 hours a year, you know, on a single unit, right? If you've got a single property, it should flow if you're doing the screening process right. If you're finding, I know a lot of people use Facebook forums now to list their properties for rent, working with real estate agents to list their properties for rent. So just making sure that if you're going to hire somebody and interview them, make sure that you understand what their screening process is, right? In terms of bringing it. But once you get a good tenant in, I mean, it's just, you know, cash the deposit, right?
Yeah.
And I think one of the biggest questions people have is how do you charge, right? It sounds like a service that would cost $1 million, but it's usually quite reasonable. And my favorite part about hiring a professional is you get to tax deduct it at the end of the year. So it's actually a cost that you can claim as a deduction against any rental income, right?
Right. So, I mean, what we charge varies. You know, we have, like I said, to small apartment buildings that are, 24 unit apartment buildings, to an investor who has 1 unit. Typically, if they have 1 unit, we're probably around the 8% of paid rent. Plus, we charge, a leasing fee whenever they have to lease a unit. That's a separate cost, because if they have a tenant in there for 10 years, they don't have to pay a leasing fee. They don't need to include that, charge in their monthly fee. It's a separate one. But on the other hand, if they're, not taking care of their unit and we are flipping tenants all the time, that's added work for us. So I think that works well, all the way down to a per door cost when it's a small apartment building. So I think it varies, or if you have even an owner who's got multiple units, You know, we have some owners that have 7, 8 units that we manage for them. So, you know, their percent might be lower. It might be around the 6% range. And they get a discount for having a larger volume. So it, you know, it varies. It depends on the location, you know, how far we have to travel to get to it. So it's very, we customize it and negotiate it individually with the investor.
Great. And I think you have brought a lot of technology right into your system as well.
Yes.
In terms of automation. So what are some of your greatest tools, I guess, in your own business dealing with landlords and tenants?
Yes. So we have a portal system. It's actually called Buildium. We just recently switched to it. And so the owners can go on at any time. We upload all the documents there for the owners. They can see their lease. They can see their move-in inspections. They can see any invoices for expenses that have occurred in a given month. The smoke detector inspection, everything they want to see is uploaded there so they can see it. They can see exactly what's going on with their unit. They can print a statement for the month for their unit. They can see money in, you know, expenses incurred and money out that was paid to them. Tenants can sign in and they can pay their rent online now. They can do it that way. So we're trying to really make it as easy as possible. So, you know, people can't say, oh, I can't get down to your building today, or I can't get you a check. It's like, oh, sign in online. You can pay it online if you want. So we try to make it as simple as possible and as user-friendly for owners so that at the end of the year, they push a button and they have a financial statement they just hand over to their accountant, and it's easy for them to calculate everything.
Yeah, I love that. Just being able to hit a button, it's all there and I don't even have to think about it, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Right. Well, I thank you very much. This has been extremely informative, and I know that I get these questions a lot and it's hard to continue to repeat them, but it's also good to hear it from an expert who's in the field doing it every single day. You've been doing it for years and years. You are a husband and wife team, and you're absolutely phenomenal to deal with. You're both are always ready to get involved. You're very passionate about it, right? I mean, you take it very, very seriously, and that's very difficult to come by. So what we'll do is, for anybody listening or viewing, we'll leave all of your information available so we can contact you. What's the best? Call the office, or what's the best way to?
Yeah, you can call the office, and my extension is 501, so 613-918-0145, and I'm extension 501. And I can put you in contact with whoever I need to in the area that you live in.
Right, and you do have other divisions, and we'll be doing another podcast on condominiums.
We do, yes, that'll be fun.
All right, well, yes, it will. Oh, we got some good stories about that. All right, well, thank you very much. I know it's been very valuable to everybody, and I think it's information that needs to get out there, right? Because you really have to be able to protect your investment in the best way possible. And we met with you, what was it? I guess it was 10 years ago, right? And you managed a multi-unit for us. And since then, one of the partners is retired and taken it over. But we had an absolutely wonderful experience. And I want to thank you very much for taking the time to speak to everybody today.
All right. Thanks, Kelly.
All right. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
All right. Bye. Bye.